everybody. Welcome to First Wednesdays, the first of this new year. I want to thank you all for coming out on this somewhat chilly winter's evening, and I'm just so grateful it wasn't last night. Before we start, if you could just turn off any devices you might have, that would be greatly appreciated. I am Lucinda Walker. I'm the director of the Norwich Public Library, and the library and the Historical Society have the great pleasure of being able to co-host First Wednesdays, which is a program of the Vermont Humanities Council. First Wednesdays is supported statewide by the Vermont Department of Libraries and the National Life Group Foundation. Tonight's event is being specially underwritten by Crossroads Academy. The Historical Society and the library would like to thank our generous underwriters, the Friends of the Norwich Public Library, the Jack and Dorothy Byrne Foundation, Ledyard National Bank, Mascoma Savings Bank, and the Norwich Historical Society. Tonight's speaker, Dr. Paul Vincent, is Professor of Holocaust Studies and History at Keene State College, and he chairs the Baccalaureate Program in Holocaust and Genocide Studies. He served as director of the Cohen Center for Holocaust Studies from 1998 to 2007. A PhD in modern European history, he has taught at Keene State College since 1985, when he came to Keene as director of the Mason Library, a position he held until 1994. Professor Vincent is author of 2 books, The Politics of Hunger, The Blockade of Germany, 1915-1919, and a historical dictionary of Germany's Weimar Republic, 1918 to 1933. Will you please join me in welcoming Professor Paul Vincent.
Thank you, Lucinda. I'm so pleased to be here. I'm always pleased to come over to Vermont. Obviously, it's not a great distance from New Hampshire, but it does seem like a different world, and it's a world that I feel very, very comfortable in. I enjoyed your wonderful restaurant here, Carpenter and Main, just a couple of doors away on Main Street. I will be staying in the Norwich Inn, which is good, because I think the roads are starting to ice up a bit, and I don't think I'd want to drive back to Keene tonight. This is the first time I have given this talk for the Vermont Humanities Council. I've been speaking for the Vermont Humanities Council for a few years now as a First Wednesday speaker. But I decided it was time to switch gears, and I did so not necessarily with the current refugee crisis as backdrop. But that refugee crisis, I think, is conducive to this particular conversation tonight. I say that knowing, however, that the write-up that came from the Vermont Humanities Council with respect to what I'm talking about tonight is just a little wrong. Not the title so much, but the write-up. And the reason being, and this is what makes it not quite so parallel, to current circumstances, the St. Louis was not turned away by the United States so much as it was turned away by Cuba. The ship did not come to the United States. It's interesting in saying this, because at the time that this happened, my father was working at a restaurant in White Plains, New York. Young man at the time, let me see, what would he have been? He'd been 18 years of age. And I asked him, do you remember the St. Louis? And he said, oh yeah, that was the ship of refugees that came to New York and was turned away. And I said, oh, that's very interesting. That ship never came to New York and was turned away, although the very same ship in February of that year, I discovered this doing research on this, did in fact come to New York with probably about 24 German refugees on it, German Jews, in February. And it made the newspaper not so much because there were Jews on the ship, but because the captain, Gustav Schroeder, who I'll mention as I'm talking to you, ran into a terrific storm, and there was concern that the ship was going to make it across the Atlantic. This was a little closer to the time of the Titanic, you might recall. But in any case, in the article, it mentioned that disembarking from the ship were a couple of dozen Jewish refugees. So the St. Louis did come to New York, but it was not in May, June of 1939. Let me see if this thing will operate for me. It did before. Always, you know, this isn't like Chautauqua 100 years ago. You have to make sure that everything works. You know, and there's so much technology, and I'm trying to talk about history, and so I live in the past, but I have to deal with the world of microphones and projectors and a computer that was a little temperamental to begin with, but is working just fine right now. This is the Voyage on this map. The ship leaves Hamburg with 937 passengers aboard, and it heads to Cuba, heads to Havana. Fact of the matter is, it didn't have 937 passengers on board when it left Hamburg. It picked up passengers in Cherbourg. Not many, maybe a dozen or so, but it did pick up passengers in Cherbourg. So that is kind of the first element that very often is incorrect, though it's a minor error. So the ship sails on a very leisurely cruise. Typically speaking, one of the ships from the Hamburg America line, this was actually not a steamship. It sometimes is misidentified as the SS St. Louis. It was actually a motor ship. It was the NS St. Louis. Typically, this ship took about 5 to 6 days to get across the Atlantic. This voyage took 2 weeks. Left on the 13th of May and did not arrive in Havana in the harbor until the 27th of May. So this was a long, leisurely voyage. And a very enjoyable voyage, at least from going to Hamburg to Havana. It was quite a number of days into the voyage. It was the 23rd of May when word came to the captain from the Hamburg America line saying that your passengers may be in violation of a new law that has come down. It was an executive order that came down. The number was 937, only coincidental that it was the same number of passengers on the ship. It was just the 937th executive order that was passed during the particular year, and it happens on, I believe, the 3rd or 4th of May. So a few days before the ship sails. And that particular executive order indicated that passengers would be allowed to disembark only if they had immigration visas. Immigration visas cost $500, roughly. Most of the passengers on the St. Louis had what were called tourist landing permits. A tourist landing permit cost somewhere in the neighborhood of $160. Much cheaper. It was an odd situation that they had tourist landing permits, but it was something that was devised by the Cuban authorities, particularly a person who was in charge of immigration. And he was making a bundle of money by doing this. So in any case, on the 23rd, 10 days into the voyage, Captain Schroeder gets this information. The information indicates that they may not be allowed to disembark. Not that they won't be, but the possibility exists. So why not continue the voyage? You're almost there already anyhow. And so that's what he decides to do. But he also decides to form a special passenger committee of 5 individuals. He called them together. He told them the news. They decided that they were going to hold this as a secret. They didn't want to raise panic amongst the passengers, especially since the possibility existed that they would be able to get off the ship. But he did contact the person who was the head of this committee, a man by the name of this convenient Yosef. He did contact what was called the Joint Relief Committee, which was in Havana. The Joint Relief Committee is a committee that was designed by the Joint Distribution Committee in New York City. These were committees that were in a variety of countries all over the world that reported back to the home base, which was in New York City. Let them know that there was a potential problem. You need to be aware of this, find out what you can, and we'll see what's going to happen. So the ship arrives on the 27th, and as many of you know, it was not allowed to disembark its passengers. In fact, it was not allowed to dock at the Hamburg America dock pier. This tells you something about the number of passengers that were on the ship and a little bit of information about who they were. Of the 937, 734 held U.S. quota numbers. These are people who they know that they don't plan on staying in Cuba. They have already registered in Germany for entry into the United States, and they have received a quota number. Now, as you can see on the bottom, 27,370 refugees or immigrants. Refugee is really the wrong word here, and that's one of the reasons in the title of the talk I have refugees in quotation marks, because we didn't have a refugee policy. No country really has a refugee policy, but we did have an immigration policy. And so these people were aiming to become permanent citizens of the United States. And so 734 held these landing permits, but also held quota numbers, which they were hoping would mature in a reasonable amount of time. Some of them might have matured in a matter of months. Some of them might have matured in a matter of a couple of years. And their plan was to stay in Cuba until such time as they were able, their number came up and they were able to get into the United States. 28 passengers disembarked of the 937. They were allowed off the ship. They got off the ship on the 2nd of June of 1939. This was almost a week into the time that the ship was in Cuba. And the reason they got off is 22 of them had in fact purchased the immigration visa. So they were allowed off the ship. They had what was determined to be the correct paperwork. The other 6, 4 of them were Cubans and 2 of them were Spaniards. And it's important to know that the reason they were on the ship at this time, the Cubans as well as the 2 Spaniards had been involved in the Spanish Civil War, which had gone badly for the Loyalists, and they had been fighting for the Loyalist side. And they had been defeated as of January of '39 by Franco's regime. And so there were, in fact, a goodly number of Spaniards who were attempting to find places to live. And in this case, there were only 2 on the ship, but those 6 people were obviously allowed off the ship. The Immigration Act of 1924 is an important piece of our history. It is, there was a provisional quota system that was put in place a bit earlier than 1924. 1920 it was passed, and beginning in 1921 we had a quota system already in place in the United States. This is during the Harding administration. Harding was very much in favor of this. Calvin Coolidge, his successor, was also very much in favor of this. And then Herbert Hoover not only was in favor of it, but felt it was far too liberal, and came up with a plan to dramatically reduce the number of immigrants that could come in by the use of likely to become a public charge clause that the State Department came up with that dated all the way back to the 1880s. And so this was used to dramatically curtail immigration, even though it had been dramatically curtailed already by the quota system. For those of you who know your American history, and know about the tens of thousands, ultimately millions, who came to Ellis Island and a variety of other points of entry in the United States. There was a vast immigration to this country between roughly 1890 and the beginning of the First World War. Obviously, the war slowed down the immigration, but the decision was made right at the tail end of the war to cut back on immigration dramatically because of a fear that the complexion of American society was being too radically changed from its original, basically Protestant Anglo-Saxon character. That this had been happening since roughly the 1880s. So the quota system went into place. This quota system, important to note, this quota system existed until 1965. 1965. This was in place for a long time. The character of our country has in fact changed dramatically in the last 50 plus years. And it's largely as a result of the disabling of the quota system and of coming up with a very different immigration law. Now, one of the things that you often hear, and unfortunately the Holocaust Museum in DC is complicit in this to some degree. Many people who know anything about the St. Louis, often what they know is that's the ship that came across the ocean, and if you're like my father, that was not allowed to disembark its Jewish passengers from Germany, and so it had to go back. And it's almost like that is the only ship that ever came across the ocean with Jewish refugees on board. They don't know about any other ship. So in the process of doing research on this, HIAS, which is the Hebrew Sheltering and Immigration Aid Society in New York City, kept track of all of the Jewish immigrants that came through. And so one of the things you discover is these various reports that come out in the New York Times throughout 1939. And you find out that assistance was given to 6,080 Jewish refugees who had arrived between January the 1st and March of 31st. And this is a report that's printed on the 1st of May, 1939. And I can assure you that these people did not swim across the ocean, that they came on ships, and that they were disembarked in American ports. And just to update this as the year goes on, you find out in the New York Times on the 23rd of July of 39, during the last 6 months, immigrants arrived on 289 ships which docked in New York Harbor, and they reported to HIAS once again. Then later in the year, in November, you have this information, and you go down to the second part that is highlighted. The report showed that during the first 9 months of this year, 16,730 Jews, refugees, and others arrived on 544 ships. Let me underscore that though it says Jews, refugees, and others, the report is coming from HIAS, and you do not have Christians that are reporting into HIAS. These are Jews. And by the way, this is only in New York City. In the year of 1939, virtually the entire quota was filled for German refugees. And the United States did not distinguish on the basis of religion. If you were a German refugee, you could have been a Protestant, a Catholic, or a Jew. The fact of the matter is you were born in Germany and you had German citizenship. Now, many of you who know anything about the Holocaust are probably familiar with the Nuremberg laws. And part of the Nuremberg laws was the development of something that was called Right Citizenship. The Right Citizenship Law was a new form of citizenship that elevated so-called Aryans. It did not remove citizenship from Jews. That was not going to happen until late 1941, when they started to deport Jews out of Germany, deporting them mostly to Poland, but also to Lithuania and Latvia and elsewhere in the East. That's when they had their citizenship removed. These people held German passports. Yes, they were stamped with a red J, but they held German passports, and they were counted in terms of the quota system as Germans. Important thing to know. But the main thing here is to recognize that we know about the St. Louis, but we don't know, at least in terms of the first 9 months of the year, about the other 543 ships that came across the Atlantic Ocean into New York with Jewish refugees on them. Now, why Cuba? This is a convoluted story, and I will try to piece it together in as understandable a fashion as I can. This largely begins with the voyage of the Ss Orinoco, which had Jewish refugees on board, and which was planning to disembark those refugees in Mexico, and Mexico turned them away. And so the decision was made by the Cuban government to allow those refugees to come to Cuba, to disembark there. Now, they were kind of put in a holding place, which was in the Havana's harbor, with a determination of what they were going to do with these people, but they were ultimately allowed to disembark in Cuba. Now, the interesting thing about this story is, again, if you know your Holocaust history, this occurs a few days before Kristallnacht. So this decision is made not in the wake of Kristallnacht, but before this ghastly event that German Jews are going to face on the 9th and 10th of November. The experience of the Orinoco led to a statement by, I think, given the age of my audience tonight, most of you have heard of a fellow named Batista, a fellow who preceded Castro, in fact was overthrown by Castro in the late 50s. Batista was posed as a friend of the United States. He was the military strong arm in Cuba at the time. He had been for a number of years. And he was, in fact, the man who was responsible for putting the person in the presidency who was in the presidency at this particular time, a fellow by the name of Laredo Bru. But in any case, Batista, after this event, went to New York City and met with a man who was a representative of the National Coordinating Committee, as well as the Joint Distribution Committee. And he made the statement, this comes right out of the New York Times, that Cuba will cooperate in providing a haven for refugees from Nazism. Cuban officials would heartily cooperate with President Roosevelt in his plan to relieve the terrible situation abroad. What was Roosevelt's plan? What is he talking about here? He is making reference back to a conference that took place in July of 1938 at Evian in France, in the border of France and Switzerland. It's a conference that has received a terrific amount of negative press from the historical community because it ended up not gaining anything, supposedly, for all of the effort that was put into it by Roosevelt. The interesting thing is, when I discovered this statement and then realized that over the next several months quite a number of people came into Cuba, Batista based his decision on Roosevelt's plea that comes out of the Avian Conference, which I think is a very important statement to indicate, well, maybe the Avian Conference was not as ineffective as we might think it was in hindsight. And so by May of '39, by the time that the St. Louis sails to Cuba, there were approximately 6,000 Jews already living in Cuba, the vast majority of them in Havana. And of those 6,000, roughly 2,000 of them had come over since this agreement had been made between Batista and Lawrence Berenson. And so this is why people look to Cuba. This is a logical place. Let's see if we can get tickets and get over to Cuba. Many of the people on the ship had either friends or relatives who had already gotten over there in the previous half year. So Cuba was a logical place not to be a permanent immigrant, but to wait out the time it took before your quota number matured and you were able to go to the United States. Again, 743 of these passengers held quota numbers. Their plan was to go to the United States. So this was a much happier and safer place to be, quite obviously, than staying in Germany at this time. So the ship arrives on the 27th. It's a Saturday morning. It arrives on the 27th, and the Cuban government does not allow it to dock up at the pier of the Hamburg America line. Again, this was a surprise to many on the ship, the vast majority on the ship, but it wasn't a surprise to some people who were hoping this wouldn't happen, but who knew that this was a possibility. And so very quickly, the Joint Relief Committee contacted New York City, contacted a woman by the name of Celia Razovsky, who was the executive director of the National Coordinating Committee for Refugees. And she called a meeting of several individuals, key individuals that worked for the NCC as well as the Joint Distribution Committee. And they met on the 29th. And they decided that they needed to respond to this. Now, why did this happen? You've met Batista. Batista's a very powerful figure in Cuba at this time, but he's not all powerful. He can't pull all of the strings and make things work here. He has placed a person in charge of immigration, a fellow by the name of Manuel Benitez. Now, Benitez was really, he's kind of a puppet of Batista's. He's somebody who had supported Batista earlier on when Batista gained power in the Cuban army. And so Batista felt beholden to Benitez, and he gives him this particular position in the government. Benitez decides, boy, this is a perfect place time to make use of this position. There are desperate people trying to get out of Europe, especially out of Germany. I'm going to make a fortune off this. If they pay $500 to get an immigration visa, that money goes directly to the government. I can let them in as tourists. Now, this is obviously playing quick and loose with the rules here, but at least that's what he decides to do. I will let them in as tourists, and all they have to do is pay the $160 for the tourist landing permit. Okay? And so that's what obviously the vast majority of people do. Now, obviously, people in the Cuban government are stupid. They realize that Benitez is making a fortune off this. This is corruption. And if we don't get to have a part of the corruption, we're going to take the high road and say this needs to be cut down. And so they're complaining to their president, Federico Laredo Bru. And in the last, basically 60 days, leading up to the sailing of the St. Louis, you start to see a rise in anti-Semitism in Cuba, especially in Havana. There's a fellow by the name of Irvin Gelman, who is a historian who did a terrific amount of work on Cuba in the 1930s. I've read his work, but we also spoke on the telephone about this. And he says he's convinced that these officials were not all that clean. They just wanted to get part of the action. But he also thinks that various Nazi agents had been infiltrated into Cuba at this time, and they were either working for the Hamburg America offices in Cuba, in Havana, or they were working for the Bayer company, the original producers of what we know of as Bayer aspirin, but it was a German firm to begin with, that they were Nazis and they were starting to inspire greater anti-Semitism there. Laredo Brew believed, well, I've got a problem here with corruption, which is starting to become a serious problem with the economics minister, with the Secretary of State of Cuba, this is also becoming a problem because there is a rise of anti-Semitism which cannot be ignored, and so he passes this Executive Action 937 right at the beginning of May. It's again just a few days before the St. Louis sails, but it's an action which requires, if you come to Cuba within 24 hours after the passage of this act, you have to hold an immigration visa. That a tourist landing permit will not be enough. Now this puts Benitez in an awkward position because so many of these have been sold already. And so Benitez attaches a document to this which indicates that if you had purchased your tourist landing permit before Executive Order 937 was put out, you'll be okay. And that goes to all of the shipping companies. It goes back to Germany. It goes to the diplomatic offices. And so people are assuming when they get on the ship that since they had purchased their landing permit before the 4th of May, they're going to be all right. That was what Benitez had interpreted this as being. Benitez got himself in trouble, as you might imagine. And he loses his position right at the beginning of July. But the other interesting thing about this, however, is Batista, who has been the person behind this, comes down with influenza. He's bedridden. Now, whether this was a case of what we would now call the blue flu, when a police department goes out on strike, or whether he actually was sick, to some degree it doesn't matter. Batista is not going to be a player in this. He has decided, I believe, and Gelman, by the way, believes this as well, that this is too dangerous of an issue. I'm going to stay away from this. I think Laredo Brew is probably right. He understands the tenor of the times. Let's go ahead and allow this to happen. So he's not involved. Now these men were not friends. Okay? This is Batista. This is Laredo Brew. I love this picture. I love this picture. It's just clearly a picture out of the late 1930s. You know, I'd like to know who this fellow is behind here. I wish I'd like to turn him into Peter Lorre in the background here. But these two men were not friends. Laredo Brew always had to look over his shoulder. Always had to be very careful not to go too far because his predecessor had been removed from office by Batista, and he knew that Batista could do the same thing to him. So, who are the Americans involved? Now, Court Du Bois and Butler Wright, the Consul General and the U.S. Ambassador, play a significant, if off the forefront, role in what's going to happen. The most significant individual, after the call is made to New York City and after the meeting takes place on the 28th of May, on the 29th of May, Lawrence Berenson and Cecilia Rezovsky fly down to Cuba. They go down as a team representing both the NCC as well as the Joint Distribution Committee. Berenson is going to negotiate with the government. That's his role. Rezovsky is going to communicate with the passengers on the ship. Let them know what's happening, try to soothe their anxiety. Hopefully this is all going to work out and we're going to be able to disembark you here yet in Cuba. Berenson was an incredibly optimistic individual. He was very self-assured. He wrote a letter to a friend of his who was at the State Department in charge of American affairs there, telling him, I have to fly down to Cuba. There's kind of a mess up here. I need to solve this problem so that we can get the people off the ship. He had made a deal with Batista. And he was self-assured that he could solve this problem. He is also the president of the Cuban-American Chamber of Commerce. So he knows Cuba, he knows Havana, he knows many of the players there. He is very self-assured. And he goes down with incredible optimism that he's going to be able to solve the problem. Anytime anyone asks him how things are going, be it Wright or Dubois or Rezovsky, he tells them not to worry, I have things in hand. He's communicating back to New York to the representatives of the JDC, the Joint Distribution Committee. He's telling them not to worry, there are a few bumps in the road, I've got things in hand. He was supposed to meet with Laredo Brew the day after he got there. That meeting was postponed. He didn't have it. He didn't worry about that. He didn't let the people he was representing in New York know about that. He wasn't concerned. What happened was on the 30th of May, the cabinet met and they determined they were not going to allow anybody off the ship. That word came back to Wright and Dubois, and they thought, uh-oh, the game's up. This isn't going to work. We're going to have to come up with something else. The very next day, a report appeared in one of the major newspapers that, in fact, the refugees are going to be allowed off the ship. This was absolutely stunning to Dubois and Wright. They communicated then with the Joint Relief Committee. Berenson answered the phone and said not to worry, that there was a meeting that was going to be held between he and Laredo Brew on the 1st of June. It appeared that we just had to get some ducks in order, that we needed to know what kind of promises needed to be made by the government, by the JDC, financial promises, and not to worry. He met with Laredo Brew, so the Americans are in the background. They're reliant upon Berenson, who seems to be in control of things. They have some question marks, but at this point they feel that he's in control of things. Well, he meets with Laredo Brew. Laredo Brew is kind of agreeable. He says, what I need to do is I want the ship to pull up steam, and as soon as it can, it needs to leave harbor. And the ship leaves Havana Harbor on the 2nd of June. And then the negotiations can resume. Okay? When this ship for 4 days is going around in circles between Havana, Cuba, and the south coast of Florida, this is a time when negotiations are continuing. And everybody is being led to believe by Berenson that this is going to work out. Didn't get their names on there, right? Okay. Okay, Berenson, I just found this photograph, by the way, of Berenson. Somebody has put it up fairly recently. So this is a much younger Laredo brew, by the way, than what he would have looked like at this particular time. Now, this is what is happening. Okay, here is a report from the New York Times on the 5th of June, indicating that the doors have been opened. This is a report that comes on the 4th, and this has been known now for a couple of days here. The doors have been opened. The passengers are going to be allowed to get off the ship. That's what everybody thinks. Now, on the 4th and 5th, the very next day, Cuba closes the doors. The negotiations break down. Laredo Brew raises the ante. He raises the ante. Why he does it is not clear. I've read all of the documentation. It's not clear. Okay? There are judgments that I can make based on what I've read that Berenson was a little too cocky. He was a little too self-assured, and it irritated President Laredo Brew. But I don't know that for sure. The Joint Distribution Committee made the determination that they don't think that Laredo Brew was ever going to allow the passengers to land. That he was just playing for time here. And so the negotiations break down, and by the 6th, this ship has to start to head back to Europe. Now, I've given you, it's more of a nutshell than anything, because there's a lot of detail here that I can't go into. Just to let you know, however, that these negotiations there were people spending all night writing up the documentation, trying to meet what the demands were of the Cuban government. And it finally fails. And it fails, and Cecilia Rosovsky doesn't even know that this is failing. She is down there as supposedly a co-equal cohort to Berenson, and he has not been bringing her up to tune on what's going on until things have collapsed. And so you begin the voyage back. This is the case of refuge denied. That goes on for better than a week here. This ship lands on the 27th, so you got the 28th, the 29th, the 30th, the 31st, the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, breaks down on the 5th, the 6th, they start to head back. It's on the 5th that Franklin Roosevelt gets involved, and he notifies Sumner Wells that we need to do everything possible to make this work, so give the Joint Distribution Committee all the support that you possibly can. But by that time, it was already too late. And the person that I hold responsible for that, as you might imagine, is Lawrence Berenson. He was too self-assured until it was too late that he was going to be able to manage this. So the ship starts to head back. Berenson is no longer a player now. He's no longer meaningful. In fact, within about 3 weeks, the JDC has basically cut their ties to him, believing that he has failed him, that they should have had somebody else there, which is a completely different attitude than what you get from their earlier. We've got the best person there. If anybody can get it done, it's Berenson. So you've got from the 6th to the 17th, 11 days. What are we going to do here? The ship is sailing back. There's the passenger committee that Schroeder put together. They're still in place, and they largely become a suicide watch committee. There's fear now. This is not the happy voyage heading to Cuba. This is fear we may be going back to Germany. And there are people that are prepared to jump overboard at this point. And the State Department is now very heavily involved. The interesting thing is there is an Intergovernmental Refugee Committee that is meeting in London at this time. It is a product of the Avian Conference that I mentioned earlier from July of 1938. It was set up by that to try to find places for German Jews to be able to go. And So it is meeting there, and as it is meeting, one of the people that's there is he's the vice chair of the Intergovernmental Refugee Committee. His name is Robert Pell. Robert Pell is a State Department official. He is the head of the Western European section of the State Department. He has been put in this position. Also over there is a member of the President's Advisory Committee on Refugees by the name of Paul Beerwald. Paul Beerwald was actually the chair of the Joint Distribution Committee. And so he was over there, and it ended up that these two men started to work together. What can we do? They weren't over there because of the St. Louis. They were over there for something much, much vaster. You know, can we send all the Jews to Alaska? You know, can we find a place elsewhere in Latin America? But now we've got this has become one of these issues that makes the front page of the New York Times every day now. And the Joint Distribution Committee is taking a lot of heat by people that are now blaming them for the failure of Cuba. So the State Department is helping them. Pell and Beerwald worked so closely together. Beerwald, the man who can pull the purse strings. Robert Pell, the diplomat. He was the consummate diplomat. And they start to work together. Let's see if we can find other places of refuge, maybe North Africa, maybe French North Africa. Maybe we can offload some of the children in French North Africa. In the process, Pell actually had a weekend where he visited a man by the name of Lord Winterton. Lord Winterton had been Britain's representative to the Avian Conference. He was very interested in refugees. And while Beerwald is with Lord Winterton, this is the weekend of the 10th and 11th of June, he receives a telegram indicating that the Joint Distribution Committee is ready to guarantee the housing of whatever Jews are offloaded in any of the countries in Western Europe so that the Jews won't have to go to Germany. Winterton is moved by this. He cuts short what was going to be a long vacation, and on the 12th of May, he takes this commitment to the cabinet. And the cabinet decides that they will take 300 of the refugees if other European countries will help. This is where Robert Pell gets involved and says he's the one that can basically lubricate the negotiations with these other countries, something that Beerwald can't do. There's another man that's been involved in this, a man by the name of Morris Troper. He is the representative in Western Europe of the Joint Distribution Committee, and he's making connections with a number of relief agencies in Western Europe. But it has to be the governments that decide to do this. And finally, on the 12th, there is agreement in general. And over the next 2 days, the 13th and 14th, that agreement becomes ironed out. And so the decision is made for the passengers to be offloaded in France, Belgium, Holland, and Great Britain. The numbers change a bit. Britain ends up taking, I think, 288, the largest contingent. And you see the name Morris Troper. Morris Troper has been working for roughly 72 hours without sleep, trying to make this work. The calls, the telegrams that are going back and forth are numerous, very, very significant. What can be said, what can't be said, what do we need to be careful with? This is a telegram that goes out to Morris Troper from the passenger committee. Remember Yosef I told you about, indicating how pleased they are, how overjoyed they are by the decision that has been made. Eternal thanks, the men and women who have been on this voyage, that they are not going back to Germany. The ship comes in the wee hours of the morning into Flushing, which is part of the Netherlands. And they pick up a pilot in Flushing. Morris Troper gets on the ship. This is about 6 o'clock in the morning when this happens. He gets on the ship, and the children on the ship, there are 200 of them. They line up, 100 on either side of one of these halls, and they applaud him and with tears and thanks of what he's done for them. It is an incredibly moving moment for these children, lots of children on the ship. This is Morris Troper with some of the children. The little girl that's looking up at him is actually Liesl Yosef. Liesl Yosef was the daughter of Yosef Yosef. And these are happy people. These are happy people. They're going to Holland or Belgium or Britain or France. This is June of 1939. And when they arrive finally in Antwerp, they go from Flushing to Antwerp, and these various refugee committees there are there to meet them. And there's a refugee committee there representing Britain. There's one representing, obviously, Belgium. There's one from Holland. There's one from France. And they distribute the passengers at this particular point. This is a happy event. And why wouldn't it be? One of the problems that we have, not just those of us who are historians, but everybody, is that we can't look back at this without the Holocaust in between. The Second World War hasn't begun. Nobody knows. There are some that predict that there will be a war, but nobody knows at this point that in a matter of just weeks in 1940, the Wehrmacht is going to overrun France and Holland and Belgium and threaten an invasion of Great Britain, Operation Sea Lion. Nobody knows that at this point. There's not a person in this room that knows exactly what's going to happen tomorrow. We are not fair to these people for judging them for what's going to happen in the future that they're unaware of. This was a success, and the success, I think, is represented in the faces of the people. This is a document that I found that I made a copy of. I made a mistake. I said it was 6 a.m. It was actually 4 a.m. in Antwerp, in Flushing rather, when they picked up Morris Troper as well as the pilot. But we pray that God's blessing be upon you. We regret exceedingly that flowers did not grow on the ship. Otherwise, we would have presented you with the largest and most beautiful bouquet. Liesl Yosef. That was written, by the way, in German. I've seen this is a translation of this. This is when they dock. These are not horrified people. These are not people that are looking at what's going to happen in the future. They know that they've been saved. Okay, to give you just some of the statistics here, and I will wrap this up. Of the passengers, I already let you know that 6 of them were not Jewish. 4 of them were Cuban, and 2 of them were Spanish. Now the math doesn't work because there was one man who died of congestive heart failure on the 23rd of May on the ship as they were going over. He got on the ship. He was a retired professor from a German university. He didn't know whether he would survive or not, and he didn't. And he dies on the 23rd, which is the same date, by the way, that the St. Louis received word that they might not be able to land, but he didn't know that. I have read one commentary that he died of shock when he found out that the passengers weren't going to be able to disembark. That's not right. It's not right. Another man, however, slit his wrist and jumped overboard in Havana Harbor. So he's not among the 907. He recovers and he's transported back to Britain. So you can see the division here of the passengers. Of the 916 who returned to the continent, 365 of them survive. So there is obviously a significant loss of those who went to France and Holland and Belgium. But an interesting piece is of the 734 who had quota numbers, roughly 450 of them end up being American citizens. They come to the United States. They come to the United States. That's in essence what I wanted to talk to you about tonight. I think it's terribly important to understand this piece of our history, and also important to recognize the differences between now and then. And again, it's something I wouldn't have pointed to not all that long ago. I would have just given this, because I am a historian and this is something I'm very interested in. And trying to understand, no issue in history is perfectly black and white. That's not history if it's black and white. It's a very simplification of history. Understanding the outcome of this, one of the things I have been asked, obviously, as a professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies, is our response to what's happening to Syrian refugees the equivalent of how we responded to the crisis that Jews were going through before the Second World War broke out. And my response to that is we are responding much worse than we did then. We had a quota. Are we going to allow 27,370 Muslims into our country on an annual basis? I mean, that would be, I can't imagine many people in Washington saying, yes, we can do that. And yet, as of May of 1939, there was no Holocaust going on. Kristallnacht had led to the death of roughly 90 to 100 people. Now, 30,000 German Jewish men were arrested in the immediate aftermath of Kristallnacht and taken to camps such as Dachau, Buchenwald, and Sachsenhausen. And many of them were brutalized, and a number of them died. So the numbers rise. I would suggest maybe 200 to 300 had died in the intervening time. But we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people who have died in Syria. It's a very different thing. And I think as the years go by, we're going to look back on this period in our history and wonder why we didn't respond in a different way. And I don't know that the connection is all that useful here, other than to say we actually responded better then than we have now. But I'll open up for questions and answers. Yes?
When Berenson was trying to negotiate in Havana, and you mentioned demands were being made, could you identify what those demands were? Were they
Okay.
demands or what?
There was, first of all, an offer for a $50,000 payment was made that was going to be a guarantee for these individuals that were going to be offloaded.
Can you repeat the question, please?
Oh, I'm sorry, yes, I was told to do that. Okay. The questioner pointed out that Berenson was faced with a number of demands. What were those demands? So one of the things that was offered by Berenson initially was a $50,000 guarantee for these passengers to be taken care of. Laredo Brew came back with that needs to be 150,000. And there were some specifications about how long certain people could stay. Young men could only stay for something like 6 years maximum. Also, and this was an interesting thing that I fault Berenson on, Laredo Brew said when they disembark, they cannot disembark in Cuba. And two other places, or in Havana, excuse me, in Cuba to be sure, but in Havana. So two other places in Cuba were identified. Berenson, it almost seemed like he ignored that, because in his first response to Laredo Brew, he talked about the ship disembarking its passengers in Havana. And I think he should have known better. It was specified that that shouldn't be done. Now, when he thought he had worked this out, the JDC had agreed to $150,000. Suddenly, the demand was changed to $500,000.
So is this a matter of money?
It became a matter of money. As opposed to judging this on a humanitarian level, it became a matter of money. And in fact, that was a very important difference here. Berenson wanted to begin the negotiations talking about the humanitarianism involved in this, and Laredo Brew basically said, I know all about that, I'm as humane as the next person. What guarantees are we going to get? These people are coming here, we've had 2,000 arrive since the beginning of January, they're taking jobs away from Cubans. Cuba is also it's not as bad a depression as the United States was in, but it's in a depressed economy, and we now have German Jews coming in, taking jobs that rightly belong to Cubans. And in fact, that's why the Minister of Economics ultimately gets involved in this as well. And not only did these people have to have a visa to get in after this point, but the decision was made that the Minister of Economics had to sign off on the request that allowed them to come in to Cuba. So it's largely the raise in the price, and the JDC actually tried to meet this, but the deadline had passed. The deadline had passed.
Did Roosevelt, or did they know anything or have any input into the raising money or this kind of money? They probably didn't even know.
No. Roosevelt was not involved in the raising of money. He was not involved in this at all until it appeared that the negotiations were at the point of failing, because all of the reports that were coming back from Du Bois and from Wright indicated that things seemed to be in hand. Let's not worry about it. And so the State Department, Sumner Welles in particular, he was the Deputy Secretary of State. Cordell Hull was the Secretary of State at this time. Basically, they felt like they didn't need to get involved. Now there are a variety of complications to this. One being that Cordell Hull had based his reputation as Secretary of State on building a good neighbor policy with Latin American countries. And this had paid some dividends over the previous few years. One of the arguments is Roosevelt could have pressured the Cubans to taking this. But the fear was what might have been lost, because had Roosevelt done that, that news would have spread throughout Latin America that they have gone back on their word of doing this. Now the other big thing about this, I mean, it's easy to talk about Roosevelt, and this is a point where I guess we can talk a little bit about Obama and about our current circumstances. Anybody who has lived through the last several years is quite clear that we have a separation of powers in this country, that the executive branch can only do so much without approval from the legislative branch, and obviously both branches then can be overridden by the judicial branch. That somehow is often forgotten when looking back at 1938, 39, 40. The quota system was put in place by Congress. It was a law. And now Roosevelt, in terms of what he might have done, he could have by executive order. Now this is, I'm stepping out on a limb he could have, by executive order, stated that the 907 passengers could be landed in the United States at the expense of the 27,370 that are allowed on the quota. Okay. They all have quota numbers. We're simply going to move them up and land them. Okay. How Congress would have responded to that, I don't know. They might have swallowed that. I'm not sure. He could not have done it outside the quota system without taking an enormous hit, which I would suggest might have led him to decide not to run for president in 1940, could have led to his impeachment over an issue that was very heated in this country at this particular time, refugees coming in, basically for some of the same reasons I mentioned with respect to Cuba, and taking jobs from Americans who had been unemployed for the last 10 years. And so the issue is very complicated with respect to that. The State Department gets involved, but he does it behind the scenes. Nobody knew about Robert Pell. Everybody knew about Morris Troper and about Paul Bearwold. Paul Bearwold and Morris Troper could not have done what they did without the help of a seasoned diplomat who was able to pull all of the parties together and get the information to them. But it was not something that the State Department wanted to take credit for. It was something they wanted the JBC to take credit for. Yeah. Please.
I strongly support liberal immigration policy. I think it's a disgrace that this country is going to serve. But I would like to put a little more, another event in your timeline comparing the current day and 1939. Back, I read somewhere someplace in the last week that I think in the late 70s, early 80s, this country was very generous in its immigration policy, that we took in a lot of people from Vietnam and other countries. And I think there's a significant difference in the situation today than it was that of 39. And I think that's 9/11.
Yeah.
That this is an enormous turning point in the history of this country and its attitudes. And there's a difference between the people on the ship who represented no threat to anything and people coming from the Middle East. And it's not to excuse that, but to explain it. And I think those situations are different. And it's a shame that we couldn't continue the magnanimous attitudes we had in 1980 towards migrants.
I totally agree. I totally agree with you. From the point of the passage of the new Immigration Act in 1965, we had roughly 20 years of very open immigration. You're absolutely right, and it's a product of the passage of that act. I would take at least some minor issue with you with respect to the belief that these immigrants coming in represented no threat. I don't think if you were to take the average American in 1939 and ask them, are these people a threat to you, that you would get a response, absolutely not. I think there was a fear, and it's a fear of, now remember, the Roosevelt administration had done reasonably well for a number of years of softening the impact of the Great Depression. There were more people employed by 1936 by far than there had been in 1933 when he took office. The banks seemed to have solidified. He had all of his alphabet soup programs that were putting people to work in this country. But then you had the Roosevelt, what's called the Roosevelt recession in 1937, where I think he oversteps pulling back on many of the New Deal programs, and we ended up sinking into depression. And that was very much used against him. And so a lot of people feared immigrants if for no other reason they were going to take my job. Now that's not a threat in the sense that they're going to blow up a building or they're going to there's going to be some other act of terrorism, but it is a threat in a different way. But I'd also point out that the House Un-American Activities Committee had begun in the 1930s, and you have fear in this country in the 1930s of people that do not hold American views with respect to democracy, and they can be on the radical right and they can be on the radical left, and how can we comb these people out? And the best way to do it is to cut back on immigration. A guy by the name of Martin Dees was responsible for an act that doesn't get passed, thank goodness, which actually called for concentration camps. That's the term that's used in the act. Now this is before concentration camps take on the same hue as they have today, but concentration camps for immigrants coming into this country. There is fear of these people. Now, turning that to 9/11, I totally understand what you're saying, but we have an ability to determine who is a good immigrant and who's not. And I don't believe that we are using the facility that we have to bring in people that would be no threat to us. Obviously, that can't be 100% achieved, but it couldn't be 100% achieved back in 1938 or 39 either. In fact, we probably have more facility for that today than we would have then. So I would say that the one thing that unites the two is fear. It's fear. Fear of the other, fear of the foreign, fear of somebody whose religion is different, fear of somebody whose color is different, fear of somebody whose language is different. We're all human beings, and I think we all have to deal with that as part of who we are. But there was no 9/11, to be sure. And the 9/11 that was suffered back at this time ended up being Pearl Harbor, and what did we do? We had relocation centers that we put Japanese Americans from the Western states. So we lumped them all together. Didn't need to happen, because studies had been done by the Army at that point. They knew the people who were potential danger, and they could have weeded those out rather than making a blanket commitment to put all of these people in relocation centers. So fear leads to irrationality, and I think we're moved very much by irrationality today, as I think we were at that point. Thank you. That's a good question. Yeah.
I was going to ask if you know much about the financial status of these 900 passengers. Did they afford their own voyage to come across the ocean?
It's a good question. It's a good question.
Did they have enough money to pay the $165 visitor's permit?
Yeah.
Because that would add up to about $150,000, which was talked about, or the $500 per head.
Yeah.
Would add up to $500,000.
Yeah. It's a good question. I can't answer this. These were, generally speaking, these were middle-class Jews from Germany. One of the reports by a New York journalist, the New York Times journalist, who was there at Antwerp watching the passengers come down, from the ship with their luggage and all, was these seem to be people that are pretty well off. And he made the comparison because he was down in southern France when Spanish refugees were flooding across the border, when it was quite clear that Franco had won.
They were well dressed in the photograph.
They were well dressed. Those refugees from Spain were not. They were pitiful. They were pitiful. Could they have, I don't know that they could have raised that kind of money. That's a lot of money in terms of 1939. This was something that the JDC couldn't do, not at a moment's notice at this point. And when they knew that they had to do this, they had an emergency meeting to discuss what can we do. We feel like we're being abused here. But we also know that we're being hammered by other organizations. The American Jewish Congress was really hammering the JDC at this point. If you can't do the job, step aside and the other people will take your place. And so this has become a very big issue publicly. But they couldn't turn this around quick enough to respond to Laredo Group at this point. So, and this is where, when Roosevelt responds and when Sumner Welles, he calls Ambassador Wright and tells him, do whatever you can do to smooth this, make this work, it was too late already. And it's saying that this is coming from the president himself. But I would suggest they didn't go back to Germany. He's not the major player, but he's a very important player until Robert Pell got involved in the help with the negotiations. By the way, Robert Pell was the uncle of Claiborne Pell, who I think virtually every university student who's gotten a Pell Grant knows that this is a very important person, and I love the connection between these two individuals. Yes, I don't know that I'm repeating the questions. I should.
In your presentation, that there were quite a number of ships that did come to New York, offloaded Jewish people. But this one ship seems to be that's the one that took the headlines.
Yeah.
Did that have any effect on the final solution? Or was Germany choreographing this whole thing as an excuse for the final solution? Because it was right after the St. Louis that they got together and came up with, nobody wants these people, we've got to come up with a final solution.
It's a good question. Is there a relationship between the St. Louis not being accepted and the final solution? I think one can make an argument that would follow the lines of what you're saying, but I mean, the issue of the final solution is important. And again, I have to put a different hat on and be a Holocaust historian here. That term, by the way, was used at three or four different points and for different things between the beginning of the war and the evolution into what we know of as the final solution. I would suggest that it's too soon to say that. I think the Avian Conference had a bigger effect on Hitler than this particular thing. The Avian Conference was a gathering of representatives from any number of nations that was kicked off by Roosevelt. I mean, Roosevelt even suggesting this was taking a chance in a country that was very isolationist at this point. But Roosevelt stated that we're not going to go beyond our current quota system. Is there any other country that is prepared to do something? Now, many of you have probably heard of Dominican Republic coming up with a suggestion that they took, I think, something like 183 by the end of the war, which is not a vast number. I wish that Cuba would get a little more recognition for the 2,000 that it took in 6 months here. In 1939, everybody says, well, it was only the Dominican Republic who agreed to take any. Well, when Hitler saw the difficulties that the avian conferees had with one another with doing this, he said at that point, nobody wants the Jews. So he does say that. He doesn't say it so much after the St. Louis. You might say that this is an episode that might correlate with what he's saying. But he wanted to get the Jews out of Germany initially. Then as the war advances, he wants to get the Jews out of any place that is now under German control. And that obviously eventually will include Poland, it will include Czechoslovakia, it will include Holland, Belgium, and France. As many of you are probably aware, there was something called the Madagascar Plan that kicks off in May of 1940 at this point, France hasn't yet collapsed, but it's going to within a matter of weeks. Why don't we ship 2 to 3 million of Europe's Jews to the island of Madagascar, which was a French colony at this point. That was referred to as the final solution. That's one of these moments when the term is used. You can find the term used about 3 or 4 different times over the course of the war. But when you get to the point of late 1941, because that's when we're talking about, when the determination is made that, and I need to be very careful here because this is a big debate. When was the decision made? The decision is made, I would suggest fairly clearly in the late summer of 41 that we're going to kill all of the Soviet Jews. They're already in the process of dealing with Polish Jews, although it's not until 42 when the decision is made to kill all the Polish Jews. And it's also at that point, in early 42, that they start to ship Jews in from various other countries. France, Slovakia, Holland. This is late in the game. And there's a German historian named Peter God, I can't remember his last name, I should. Longerich, who thinks that the ultimate decision was not made until roughly April or May of 1942 to do what they end up doing. Which leads, even in the death throes of the Third Reich, to sending soldiers all the way to the Greek islands to find a handful of Jews and ship them back. And this is a country that is collapsing under the weight of the Red Army moving west. And yet they are still prepared to find every Jew that's within access to them. That was not something they would have done in 41. By 44 they're doing that. I could teach a course on that. In fact, I do. Thank you. Thank you for all coming.